We are taught history as a concrete entity, an established fact, immutable and unchangeable. In reality, though, it's a living, breathing thing, composed of different accounts written by victors and survivors, and new discoveries made by modern historians and archaeologists. Our team is creating Tectonicus, On the Edge of War, to allow players to deepen their understanding of the complex nature of history through engaging narrative and gameplay. Our biggest upcoming addition, the Story Mode, takes place in a timeless library, a location metaphorically representing history itself. When a mysterious corruptive force begins spreading through the timeless library and threatening the written histories within it, the unnamed protagonist, the role of which the player assumes, is entrusted with a mission to restore the corrupted history of three civilizations: Vikings, Anglo-Saxons, and Franks. The player will lead the great heathen army and witness the establishment of England. Each faction's history is contained in a faction book. To decide what will be filled in, the player will interact with the library's inhabitants, historical figures from across the centuries including kings, chroniclers, seers, and scholars. The protagonist must join and resolve their debates about the past, deciding which version of history will be recorded in the Great Tome. Once the player decides, characters who disagree will challenge the player to a card game duel to fight over whose account should be written down. The player will witness their choice come to life and become a warlord on the battlefield, inside the history they write, represented by the card game. The battles of Tectonicus bring together mechanics of strategy games, auto battlers, and card games to let the player delve into historical warfare and tactics. The combat takes place on a tiled board, representing how a strategic warlord sees the battlefield, as a variety of possibilities of how to place units in the most efficient way against the opponent. Historical battles rarely were about two crowds of warriors running at each other with wild screams, without any strategy behind it. This is a common stereotype that our game debunks through its mechanics. But let's get back to our board. Each side commands an army, represented by a card deck. The player can deploy units by dragging a card from their hand onto the board. Before the beginning of each battle, a so-called mulligan phase occurs, where the player guides their warlord towards an optimal opening strategy. The player will choose which out of the four initial cards they want to keep on their hand and which they want to exchange for other random cards from their deck. Each turn, the sides have limited number of action points that can be used to deploy unit cards and orders from their hand, or draw more cards from the deck. This mechanic mimics the limited amount of measures a warlord would be able to undertake to react in time to the opponent's actions. The turns happen simultaneously for both sides. Thus, the player is to not only adapt their strategy to the opponent's decisions, but also try to anticipate the opponent's actions. This rare approach to turn-based battles lets the player assume the realistic role of a warlord. Once both sides have made their decisions for this turn, they confirm it by pressing the end turn button. The units start moving towards their opponent's side and, sooner or later, clash in combat. On a real battlefield, morale is the factor that weighed heavy on an army's success. The clashes between armies were rarely led until a single warrior was left standing. On the battle board, when one of your units is defeated, or when the enemy attacks your safe zone, you lose one morale point. The first side to lose all of their morale loses the battle. As with a total loss of morale, warriors would lose faith and abandon fighting. Besides the story mode that is currently being integrated into the game, the single-player experience will also feature a scenario mode. It will include predefined scenarios of renowned battles based on most widely accepted historical sources. The decks will be representing the armies of the two sides, and the battle board will include the conditions in which the fight took place. Currently, we have 6 scenarios with different backgrounds and soundtracks, in which the player can already choose from 7 pre-assembled decks to play. 2 available for the Viking faction, 2 for the Anglo-Saxons, and 3 for the Franks. The factions will be equally represented in the game, avoiding a one-sided perspective on the events of the Viking Age. Each faction has its unique units, strategies, and strengths, based on how these civilizations historically led their wars and what battle tactics they tended to use. Apart from the pre-assembled decks, the player can build and save their own decks. The game already features 3 difficulty levels. The higher the difficulty, the smarter your AI opponent. Now, let's finally look at the cards themselves. There are 5 types of cards in the game. Units that represent groups of warriors, hero and commander cards representing powerful historical figures, action cards, which are orders and tactics a warlord uses during a battle, and finally, history cards, the forces of history itself, affecting the units on the battlefield depending on their historical accuracy, a unique card type. There will soon be one more type, auxiliaries. They will represent a wide range of entities whose primary role is not direct combat. Medics, religious figures, messengers, drummers, as well as objects like baggage trains or relics, the importance of which in battles is often underestimated. Thus, auxiliary cards will also be used to gauge into specific cultural aspects beyond warfare. The most unique part of our cards is their history power. It shows how historically accurate a card is. 3 stands for a well-attested concept. 2 is for controversial interpretations. And 1 is for history misuse or fiction. It is important to note that our cards not only represent most well-attested historical concepts, but also deliberately illustrated that some concepts of the past are debatable. For example, the likelihood of Vikings being tall. It is commonly accepted that Vikings were tall, yet there is also research suggesting they used their small stature to their advantage to sneak into villages undetected. That is why the card Tall Vikings that you see on the screen has its history power equal to 2 out of 3. For now, you can only see a number, but soon there will be added text labels indicating the categories of historical accuracy. For example, consensus or controversial. To the right of the history power icon, we have a card's name and type. Here, we have traits, which determine the characteristics of a card and how it behaves on the battlefield. For example, cavalry is fast and good at charging, while ranged units are efficient when they stay in the back, avoid melee combat, and shoot arrows at the opponent. We even have cultural aspects represented by traits like, for example, pious, which synergizes with religious cards to draw threads to the culture and history beyond combat. Attack power is how much damage a card deals, and health is how much damage this card can take itself before being defeated. Finally, here we have the description of the card's individual ability. If we right-click on the card, a new screen opens, where soon each card's historical and strategic descriptions will be placed for reference. Many artworks are still in progress, and some cards have placeholder art waiting to be drawn or finalized by our artists. The whole user interface of the game is undergoing a restyling process. The sound and music in this video and in our prototype have been produced in-house to be the most authentic accompaniment to our game, anchored by history. Even more unique, research, soundtrack, and compositions are in progress. In addition to the deep single-player experiences, our engineers tested the multiplayer mode, where players can already create and join lobbies to fight on historical battlefields with friends. The multiplayer mode is designed to be safe and will not feature any chatting or account creation. Game designers, meanwhile, continue designing and testing new game features and improvements to existing ones. Finally, Our historians oversee everything you see in our game, from new mechanics and the overarching story to the subtle differences in bow sounds and smallest links of chainmail in the artworks, to make Tectonicus the historically accurate game about the Viking Age. By leveraging all the game's elements we've just seen, Tectonicus doesn't simply convey history. To the most advantages that the video game medium has to offer, our experience will challenge players to see the biases of those who write history, and how fluid its nature is. We want players to not only enjoy original gameplay, but also adopt a wider look at history and culture, and a critical multi-perspective mindset that will stay with them for life.